The old woman sat alone in her living room, the same room where she had spent the last 40 years of her life. The wallpaper was faded now, peeling slightly at the corners near the ceiling. The furniture was old but clean, each piece holding memories she could never throw away. In the corner stood a piano, a beautiful instrument that had been with her since she was a young bride. Its wood was worn smooth from decades of use, and some of the keys had turned yellow with age. But it still played as beautifully as the day her late husband had surprised her with it. She was 82 years old. Her hands were not what they used to be. Arthritis had settled into her joints years ago, making her fingers stiff in the mornings and sore by evening. Her hair had gone completely white, and she kept it pinned back in a simple bun the way her mother had taught her. She wore the same style of clothes she had always worn: modest dresses with small flower patterns, comfortable shoes with low heels. She had never been one for fashion or trends. She believed in practicality and dignity. For 50 years, she had taught piano lessons to the children in her small town. Generations of students had sat beside her on that piano bench, their small fingers stumbling over scales while she patiently guided them. Some had gone on to become professional musicians. Others had simply learned to appreciate the beauty of music. She never charged much for her lessons, just enough to help with the bills. Teaching was not about money for her. It was about sharing something she loved. Her husband had passed away 12 years ago. Cancer took him slowly, and she had been by his side until the very end. After he was gone, the house felt too big and too quiet. Her 2 children had moved to different cities long ago, building their own lives and families. They called every Sunday and visited on holidays. But most days, it was just her and the piano. She did not mind the solitude. She had her routines: morning tea at 7, a walk around the garden at 9 if the weather was nice, piano practice for at least 2 hours every afternoon. She still played every single day, just as she had since she was 7 years old. 75 years of playing. The piano was not just an instrument to her. It was her oldest friend, her companion through every joy and every sorrow. Her granddaughter visited more often than the others. A bright young woman in her early 20s. She was studying to become a nurse. Money was tight for her, as it often is for young people working their way through school. She worked part-time at a grocery store and took out loans to cover her tuition. The old woman wished she could help more, but her savings were modest, just enough to keep herself comfortable in her remaining years. One afternoon, her granddaughter came over for tea. They sat together in the living room, talking about small things. When the young woman's eyes landed on the piano, "Grandma," she said slowly, as if an idea was forming in her mind. "Have you ever thought about performing again?" The old woman laughed softly. "Performing? Dear, I have not performed in front of anyone, except my students, in over 30 years. But you are so talented. You always have been. I remember when I was little, you would play for hours, and I would just sit there, completely amazed. That is very sweet of you to say. I am serious." Her granddaughter leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "There is this talent show on television, a big one. People from all over the country audition for it. The winner gets a huge cash prize." The old woman shook her head. "Those shows are for young people. Singers, dancers, people who want to be famous. Not for someone like me. That is not true. They have all kinds of people, all ages. I have seen older contestants before. I am 82 years old. My hands shake. My back hurts if I sit too long. I would make a fool of myself." Her granddaughter was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that the old woman would remember for a long time. "Grandma, you have spent your whole life giving to other people. You taught hundreds of kids. You took care of Grandpa when he was sick. You helped Mom and Uncle with everything they ever needed. When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" The old woman did not have an answer. After her granddaughter left that day, the conversation stayed with her. She tried to push it out of her mind, but it kept coming back. That night, she sat at her piano and played for longer than usual. Her fingers moved across the keys, playing pieces she had learned as a child, pieces she had performed in recitals decades ago, pieces that still lived inside her like old friends. What she did not know was that her granddaughter had already made a decision. Without telling her, the young woman had gone online and submitted an application to the television talent show. She uploaded an old video she had taken on her phone last Christmas, a video of her grandmother playing a Chopin piece, while the family listened in the background. She wrote a short description about her grandmother's life, her years of teaching, her dedication to music. 3 weeks later, the phone rang. The old woman answered it the way she always did, politely and with patience. The voice on the other end was young and energetic, talking fast in a way that made her head spin. "Hello, is this Mrs. Chen? This is calling from the talent show. We received your audition tape, and we would love to have you come in for a live audition." She was confused. "I am sorry. I think you have the wrong person. I did not send any audition tape." There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice continued, slightly slower this time. "It says here the application was submitted by your granddaughter. She sent us a video of you playing piano. It was beautiful. Our producers were very impressed." The old woman did not know what to say. Her mind was racing. Her granddaughter had done this behind her back. She felt a flash of frustration. Then something else. Something that surprised her. A tiny spark of curiosity. "I see," she finally said. "I will need to think about it." She called her granddaughter that evening. The young woman was apologetic, but also hopeful. "I know I should have asked you first. I am sorry. But, Grandma, they want you. They actually want you to audition. This could be amazing. I do not know about this. These television shows, they are not interested in old women playing classical music. They want excitement. They want drama. Maybe. But they called you, didn't they? That has to mean something." The old woman was quiet. She looked at the piano across the room. 75 years. 75 years of practice. Of discipline. Of love for something that never asked for anything in return. She had never sought fame or recognition. The music itself had always been enough, but her granddaughter's words echoed in her mind. When was the last time she did something just for herself? Maybe this was foolish. Maybe she would walk onto that stage and embarrass herself in front of millions of people. Maybe the judges would laugh. Maybe the audience would pity her. She was old, after all. She knew how the world looked at old people, especially old women. They were invisible. They were irrelevant. They were just waiting to fade away. But there was something else inside her, too. Something stubborn and proud that had carried her through every difficulty in her life. She had survived hard times, raised a family, buried a husband, and kept playing through all of it. She had never let anyone tell her who she was or what she was worth. "All right," she said into the phone. "I will do it." Her granddaughter screamed with joy on the other end. The old woman held the phone away from her ear and smiled. Just a little. She had no idea what she was walking into. The day of the audition came faster than she expected. Her granddaughter drove her to the city, a 3-hour journey that felt both too long and too short at the same time. The old woman sat in the passenger seat, watching the small towns and open fields give way to tall buildings and crowded highways. She had not been to the city in years. It felt louder and faster than she remembered. The studio was in a massive building downtown, the kind of place that looked like it was made entirely of glass and steel. People rushed in and out through the front doors, most of them young, most of them dressed in ways that made the old woman feel out of place. She had chosen her best dress for today, a deep blue one with small white flowers that she usually saved for church on Easter Sunday. She had pinned her hair back neatly and put on the pearl earrings her husband had given her on their 30th anniversary. She wanted to look dignified. She wanted to look like she belonged. But as soon as she stepped inside, she knew she did not belong here. The lobby was chaos. Hundreds of people filled the space, all of them waiting for their chance to audition. There were dancers stretching in corners, singers humming to themselves, young people practicing tricks and routines. Music blasted from somewhere down the hall. Cameras were everywhere, filming everything. capturing every nervous face and hopeful smile. A young woman with a headset and a clipboard approached them. She looked tired, like she had already dealt with too many people today. "Name?" she asked without looking up. "Chen," the old woman said. "I received a call about an audition." The young woman scrolled through her tablet, then stopped. She looked up, and for a moment, her eyes traveled over the old woman from head to toe. There was something in that look, something that made the old woman's stomach tighten. It was not cruelty exactly. It was more like curiosity mixed with doubt. "Piano, right? Classical?" "Yes, Chopin," the young woman nodded slowly. "Okay. Follow me." They were led through a maze of hallways, past dressing rooms and equipment areas, until they reached a large waiting room filled with other contestants. The old woman's granddaughter had to stay behind. Only performers were allowed past this point. They hugged quickly, and the young woman whispered in her grandmother's ear, "You are going to be amazing. I believe in you." Then she was gone, and the old woman was alone. She found a seat in the corner of the waiting room and sat down carefully. Her back was already starting to ache. Around her, the other contestants talked and laughed, comparing stories about how they got here and what they planned to do on stage. Most of them were in their 20s or 30s. A few teenagers sat in a group nearby, giggling nervously. The old woman was by far the oldest person in the room. Nobody spoke to her. A few glanced her way, their expressions a mix of confusion and pity, then quickly looked away. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. An hour passed. Then, 2. The room slowly emptied as contestants were called one by one to perform. Each time a name was announced, the person would jump up excitedly, and the others would wish them good luck. When they returned, some were crying with joy, others looked devastated, their dreams crushed in a matter of minutes. The old woman watched it all quietly, trying to calm the flutter of nerves in her chest. Finally, a man with a clipboard appeared at the door. He was young, maybe 30, with slicked back hair and an expensive-looking suit. He scanned the room, and his eyes landed on her. "Mrs. Chen, you are next. Follow me." She stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in her knees. The man did not wait for her. He walked quickly, and she had to hurry to keep up, her low heels clicking against the hard floor. As they walked, he spoke into a small radio clipped to his collar. "Yeah, she is on her way. The old lady. Piano." "Yeah, that one." He glanced back at her over his shoulder, and she saw him smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something she did not. "So Chopin, huh?" he said, slowing down just enough to walk beside her. "That is pretty ambitious for someone your age." "I have been playing for 75 years, she replied calmly. "I think I can manage." He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Sure, I am sure you will do great." They reached a set of heavy doors. Beyond them, she could hear the muffled sound of a crowd, thousands of people waiting to be entertained. The man stopped and turned to face her. "Okay, here is how it works. When you hear your name, you walk out to center stage. The host will ask you a few questions. Then you perform. The judges will give their feedback. Simple enough?" She nodded. "Good luck out there," he said. But his tone made it clear he did not mean it. She stood alone behind the doors for what felt like an eternity. Her heart was beating faster now. She could feel it pounding in her chest, in her throat, in her ears. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She thought about her piano at home, the one her husband had given her. She thought about all the students she had taught over the years, all the young hands she had guided across the keys. She thought about her granddaughter, somewhere in this building, believing in her. Then she heard her name. The doors opened, and the lights hit her like a wave. For a moment, she could not see anything. Just brightness, blinding and overwhelming. She blinked, and slowly, the world came into focus. The stage was enormous, bigger than anything she had ever stood on before. The audience stretched out before her, row after row of faces, thousands of people staring at her. She began to walk. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. She could feel every eye on her, feel the weight of their judgment. Some people in the audience started whispering to each other. A few laughed quietly. She heard someone say, "Is this a joke?" The word stung, but she kept walking. The host stood at center stage, a tall man with a perfect smile and a perfect suit. He watched her approach with an expression that was polite on the surface, but mocking underneath. She had seen that look before, many times in her life. The look people give when they think you are too old, too slow, too irrelevant to take seriously. Well, the host said into his microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next contestant." The applause was thin and scattered, more polite than enthusiastic. A few people clapped out of obligation. Most just watched with curious, skeptical eyes. "So," the host continued, leaning toward her slightly, "tell us a little about yourself. What brings you here today?" She spoke into the microphone he held toward her, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "I am 82 years old. I have been teaching piano in my town for 50 years. I am here because my granddaughter believes in me, and I wanted to do something for her." The host nodded, but she could see he was not really listening. He was performing for the crowd, playing a role. 82 years old. That is incredible. And you think you can compete with performers half your age? A quarter of your age? There was laughter from the audience. Loud, open laughter. She felt her cheeks flush with heat. "I am not here to compete with anyone," she said quietly. "I am just here to play." The host raised his eyebrows in exaggerated surprise. "Well then, let us see what you have got." He gestured toward the grand piano sitting at the edge of the stage. It was beautiful, gleaming black under the lights. She walked toward it slowly, feeling the eyes of the world on her back. Behind her, she heard more whispers, more laughter. She heard a judge say something into their microphone, and the audience burst into giggles. She did not turn around. She did not let them see her face. She sat down on the bench, adjusted her position, and placed her trembling fingers on the keys. The entire auditorium fell silent, waiting to see her fail. She sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, and for a moment she could not move. The silence in the auditorium was heavy, pressing down on her like a weight. She could feel thousands of eyes watching her, waiting for her to do something, waiting for her to fail. Her fingers were trembling. She looked down at them, these hands that had served her so faithfully for so many years. They were old now, wrinkled and spotted with age. The joints swollen from arthritis. They did not look like the hands of a performer. They looked like the hands of a grandmother, which is exactly what she was. Behind her, she heard someone cough. Then a whisper. Then a quiet laugh. The sounds cut through the silence like small knives, and she felt her confidence begin to crack. What was she doing here? She was 82 years old. She belonged at home, in her living room, playing for no one but herself. She did not belong on this stage, under these lights, in front of these people who had already decided she was a joke. She thought about her granddaughter. The young woman was somewhere in this building, probably watching on a monitor, hoping and praying that her grandmother would not be humiliated. She had done this out of love, out of belief. She truly thought her grandmother could impress these people. But now, sitting here with her trembling hands and her pounding heart, the old woman was not so sure. She glanced toward the judge's table. 3 people sat there, each one famous in their own right. She did not know much about them, but she could see from their faces that they were not expecting anything special. One of them, a man with gray hair and an expensive watch, was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, a bored expression on his face. Another, a woman with bright red lipstick and perfectly styled hair, was whispering something to her assistant. The third judge, a younger man with tattoos on his arms, was looking at his phone. None of them were paying attention. None of them cared. The host had walked off to the side of the stage, giving her space to perform. But even from the corner of her eye, she could see him smirking. He was waiting for this to be over. They all were. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was no longer on a stage. She was back in her living room, sitting at her old piano. The one with the yellowed keys and the worn wood. She could smell the familiar scent of her home. The lavender soap she used, the old books on the shelves, the faint trace of her husband's cologne that still lingered on his favorite chair even after all these years. She thought about him, her husband. The man who had loved her for 53 years, who had bought her that piano as a wedding gift, who had sat in his armchair every evening and listened to her play. He never grew tired of hearing her. Even when she played the same piece 100 times, he would close his eyes and smile, lost in the music. "You have a gift," he used to tell her. "Do not ever let anyone make you feel small." She opened her eyes. The auditorium was still there. The lights were still blinding. The audience was still waiting. But something had shifted inside her. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. Something else had taken its place, something quieter and stronger. She straightened her back. She lifted her chin. She placed her fingers on the keys with purpose this time, not hesitation. And then she began to play. The first note rang out into the silence, pure and clear. It hung in the air for just a moment. And then the second note followed. And the third. The opening of Chopin's Ballade. No. 1-inch G minor filled the auditorium, soft and haunting, like a whisper from another world. At first, nothing changed. The audience was still. The judges were still. Everyone was waiting, still expecting her to stumble, to make a mistake, to prove that she did not belong here, but she did not stumble. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone her age. The music flowed out of her, not mechanically, not like someone simply hitting the right notes, but with feeling, deep, profound feeling. Every phrase told a story, every melody carried emotion. This was not just a performance. This was a lifetime of love and loss and joy and sorrow, all pouring out through her fingertips. The piece began softly, gently, like a memory surfacing from a dream. She played the opening theme with tenderness, each note placed with care. Then the music began to build, slowly at first, then with growing intensity. The melody rose and fell, twisted and turned, taking the listener on a journey through light and shadow. In the audience, something began to change. The whispers stopped. The laughter stopped. People who had been looking at their phones put them down. People who had been talking to their neighbors fell silent. One by one, they began to really listen. A woman in the front row leaned forward in her seat, her mouth slightly open. A man near the back wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, surprised by the tears that had appeared without warning. A teenager who had come to see the flashy acts and the big performances found herself unable to look away from the small, elderly woman at the piano. At the judges' table, the change was even more dramatic. The man with the gray hair had uncrossed his arms. He was sitting up straight now, his bored expression replaced by something that looked like shock. The woman with the red lipstick had stopped whispering to her assistant. Her hand was covering her mouth, and her eyes were glistening. The younger judge had put down his phone and was staring at the stage with an intensity that had not been there before. The host, standing at the side of the stage, had lost his smirk. He was watching her now with a look that was hard to read. Confusion, maybe, or respect, or something in between. But the old woman saw none of this. Her eyes were closed again, and she was lost in the music. She was no longer in the auditorium. She was everywhere and nowhere. She was 7 years old, sitting at her mother's piano, learning her first scales. She was 25, playing at her wedding while her husband watched her with tears in his eyes. She was 40, teaching a shy little girl who would grow up to become a concert pianist. She was 70, playing alone in her living room on the first night after her husband's funeral, letting the music say all the things she could not put into words. She was all of these things at once, and the music carried every moment, every memory, every piece of her soul. The ballade built toward its climax, the notes coming faster and more powerful. Her small hands moved with a strength and speed that seemed impossible. The melody thundered through the auditorium, filling every corner, reaching every heart. It was not just sound anymore. It was something alive, something that demanded to be felt. And then, as quickly as it had risen, the music began to fall. The storm passed. The thunder faded. The final section of the piece was quiet again, gentle and sorrowful, like saying goodbye to someone you love. The last notes hung in the air, fragile and beautiful, and then there was silence. She lifted her hands from the keys. She opened her eyes. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The lights seemed too bright. The space too large. She blinked, coming back to herself. Coming back to the stage. The auditorium was completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. And then, from somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap, then another, and another, and then the whole world exploded. The applause hit her like a wave. It started from the back of the auditorium and rolled forward, growing louder and louder until it filled every inch of the space. People were rising from their seats, one row at a time, until the entire audience was on their feet. The sound was overwhelming, a roar of clapping hands and cheering voices that seemed to shake the walls. The old woman sat frozen at the piano, her hands still hovering above the keys. She did not understand what was happening. For a moment, she thought something had gone wrong. Maybe she had made a mistake she did not notice. Maybe they were laughing at her again. But then she looked out at the crowd, and she saw their faces. They were not laughing. They were crying. Tears streamed down the cheeks of strangers. Men and women, young and old, people from all walks of life, all of them moved by what they had just witnessed. Some were wiping their eyes with tissues. Others were not even trying to hide their emotions, letting the tears fall freely as they clapped with everything they had. She turned to look at the judge's table, and what she saw there nearly broke her heart. The man with the gray hair, the one who had looked so bored before she started playing, was standing now. His arms hung at his sides, and his face was wet with tears. He was not even clapping, he was just standing there, staring at her, as if he had seen something he could not explain. The woman with the red lipstick had both hands pressed against her chest. Her perfectly applied makeup was ruined. Dark streaks running down her cheeks where her mascara had smeared. She was shaking her head slowly, over and over, like she could not believe what she had just heard. The younger judge, the one with the tattoos who had been looking at his phone, was on his feet too. He was clapping harder than anyone, his hands coming together again and again, his expression completely transformed. The boredom and indifference were gone. In their place was something that looked like wonder. The host walked slowly back to center stage. His confident smile was gone. His shoulders seemed lower somehow, his posture less certain. When he reached her, he did not say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. The applause continued. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It showed no sign of stopping. Finally, the host lifted his microphone. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I have been doing this show for 8 years. I have seen thousands of performers on this stage, but I have never, in all my time here, seen anything like what we just witnessed." The audience cheered even louder. The old woman did not know what to do. She had never experienced anything like this in her entire life. Even in her younger years, when she had performed at recitals and small concerts, the response had been polite applause, kind words, nothing more. This was something else entirely. This was overwhelming. She tried to stand, but her legs felt weak. The host noticed and quickly moved to help her, offering his arm for support. She took it gratefully, her small hand gripping his sleeve as she rose from the piano bench. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, away from the microphone. She nodded, though she was not entirely sure. He guided her to the center of the stage, where she could face the audience properly. The standing ovation continued. People were shouting now, calling out words of praise and encouragement. She heard fragments of what they were saying. "Beautiful. Incredible. We love you." She felt her eyes begin to sting. She had promised herself she would not cry. She was not a woman who showed her emotions easily, especially not in public. But this was too much. The tears came before she could stop them, rolling down her wrinkled cheeks and falling onto her blue dress with the white flowers. The host turned to the judges. "Well," he said, his voice still unsteady, "I think our judges have something to say." The woman with the red lipstick was the first to speak. She picked up her microphone with trembling hands. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking directly at the old woman. "When you walked out on this stage, I did not take you seriously. I looked at you and I saw an old woman who did not belong here. I thought this was going to be a waste of time." She paused, pressing her lips together tightly. "I was so wrong. What you just did up there was one of the most beautiful things I have ever heard in my life. You did not just play that piano. You spoke to every single person in this room. You made us feel things we forgot we could feel." The audience applauded again. The younger judge went next. He leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "I need to be honest with you," he said. "Before you started, I was bored. I thought I knew exactly what was going to happen. Another forgettable performance. Another person going home disappointed. But you proved me wrong. You proved all of us wrong. That was not just music. That was a masterclass. That was 75 years of dedication and love, and every single second of it showed." More applause, more cheers. Finally, the man with the gray hair spoke. He had been silent this whole time, still standing, still staring at her with that strange expression on his face. When he picked up his microphone, his hand was shaking. "I am a musician myself," he said slowly. "I have been playing and producing music for over 40 years. I have worked with some of the greatest artists in the world. I have heard performances that most people only dream about." He stopped, taking a deep breath. "But what you just did, what I just witnessed, that was something different. That was not about technique or skill, though you have plenty of both. That was about truth. You played with your whole heart, your whole soul. You gave us everything you had, and you asked for nothing in return." His voice broke slightly on the last words. "I am honored to have been in this room tonight, truly honored." The old woman stood in the center of the stage, surrounded by this flood of praise, and she did not know what to say. She had come here expecting to be laughed at. She had come here expecting to fail. She had come here because her granddaughter believed in her, not because she believed in herself. But something had happened when she sat down at that piano. Something had taken over. All those years of practice, all those hours of playing alone in her living room, all those memories of her husband and her students and her life, they had all come together in that one performance. She had not been trying to impress anyone. She had not been trying to prove anything. She had simply played the way she always played, with honesty and love, and somehow, that had been enough. The host asked her if she wanted to say anything. She looked out at the audience, at all those faces still wet with tears, all those hands still clapping. She thought about her granddaughter, who was probably crying harder than anyone right now. She thought about her husband, who she knew was watching from somewhere, smiling that gentle smile of his. She thought about all the students she had taught over the years, scattered across the country, living their own lives. She leaned toward the microphone. "Thank you," she said simply. "I am just an old woman who loves the piano. That is all I have ever been. But tonight, you made me feel like that was enough." The audience erupted one more time, louder than before, and somewhere backstage, a young woman with tears streaming down her face whispered to herself, "I knew it. I always knew it." The video went online that same night. By morning, it had been viewed 2 million times. By the end of the week, that number had climbed to 50 million. People all over the world were watching the old woman in the blue dress sit down at the piano and silence an entire auditorium. They were sharing it with their friends and family. They were posting it on their social media accounts with captions like, "This made me cry," and "Watch until the end," and "Faith in humanity restored." News outlets picked up the story. Reporters wanted interviews. Talk shows sent invitations. The old woman's phone, which usually only rang when her children called on Sundays, would not stop buzzing. Her granddaughter had to help her figure out how to turn off the notifications because the constant noise was giving her a headache. "Grandma, you are famous," the young woman said, scrolling through the endless comments and messages. "People from Japan are writing to you. From Brazil. From South Africa. The whole world knows who you are." "Fikra." The old woman shook her head slowly, still not quite believing it. "I just played a song," she said. "I have played that same song 1,000 times. But this time, the world was listening." The competition continued over the following weeks. There were more rounds, more performances, more chances to be eliminated. The old woman advanced through each one, not because she was trying to win, but because she simply did what she had always done. She sat at the piano and she played with her whole heart. Each time, the audience responded the same way: standing ovations, tears, thousands of people moved by something they could not quite put into words. The other contestants, the young singers and dancers and performers who had once looked at her with confusion and pity, now looked at her with respect. Some of them came up to her backstage to shake her hand or ask for advice. One young man, barely 20 years old, told her that watching her perform had changed the way he thought about music. "I used to think it was about being the best," he said. "About having the most talent, the most skill, the most fame. But you showed me it is about something deeper than that. It is about connection. About being honest, about giving people something real." She patted his hand gently. "You already have everything you need inside you," she told him. "You just have to be brave enough to let it out." The finals arrived on a cold night in December. The auditorium was packed with more people than ever before. Cameras from networks around the world were broadcasting the event live. Millions of viewers sat in their homes, watching on their televisions and phones and computers, waiting to see who would win. The old woman sat backstage, alone in a quiet corner, her hands folded in her lap. She was not nervous anymore. The fear that had gripped her on that first day had faded, replaced by a calm she had not expected. Whatever happened tonight, she had already received more than she ever dreamed of. She had been heard. She had been seen. She had touched people's hearts in a way she never thought possible. Her granddaughter appeared in the doorway. The young woman was dressed up for the occasion, her hair done nicely, her eyes bright with excitement. But when she saw her grandmother sitting there so peacefully, she slowed down and approached quietly. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. "I am ready," the old woman replied. "Whatever happens, I am ready." They hugged for a long moment, holding each other tight. So much had changed since that afternoon when the young woman had first mentioned the talent show. So much had happened that neither of them could have predicted. But through it all, their bond had only grown stronger. "Thank you," the old woman whispered, "for believing in me when I did not believe in myself." Her granddaughter pulled back, her eyes glistening. "You taught me everything I know about believing in people. I just returned the favor." The final performance was her best one yet. She played a different piece this time, one she had not performed in public for over 30 years. It was a composition by Beethoven, his Piano Sonata No. 14, the one people call the Moonlight Sonata. She had learned it as a young woman, and it had always held a special place in her heart. It was the piece she had played for her husband on their first anniversary. It was the piece she had played at his funeral. The music filled the auditorium like moonlight filling a dark room, soft and gentle at first, then building slowly, each note carrying the weight of a lifetime. The audience sat in complete silence, barely breathing, afraid to break the spell. When she reached the final movement, the tempo quickened, the music became urgent and passionate, her fingers flying across the keys with a fire that seemed impossible for someone her age. And then it was over. The last note faded into silence. The standing ovation lasted longer than any that had come before. People were not just clapping. They were cheering, shouting, some of them openly sobbing. The judges did not even try to hide their emotions. All three of them were on their feet, applauding with tears running down their faces. When the votes were counted and the results were announced, no one was surprised. The old woman had won. She had beaten performers half her age, a quarter of her age. She had won not because she was the most technically perfect, or the most flashy, or the most entertaining. She had won because she was real, because she had given people something they did not even know they were missing. The host handed her the trophy, a golden statue that felt heavy in her small hands. Confetti rained down from the ceiling. Music played over the speakers. The audience continued to cheer, but the old woman was not thinking about the trophy. She was thinking about the prize money, every penny of which she had already decided to give away. Half would go to her granddaughter, to help pay for nursing school. The other half would go to music programs in schools that could not afford instruments or teachers. She wanted other children to have the chance to discover what she had discovered all those years ago. That music was not just sound. It was a way of speaking when words were not enough. Reporters surrounded her after the show, asking questions, pushing microphones toward her face. One of them asked what she wanted to say to all the people watching around the world. She thought for a moment, then smiled. "I want them to know that it is never too late," she said. "It is never too late to share your gift with the world. It does not matter how old you are or what you look like, or what anyone else thinks of you. If you have something beautiful inside you, do not let fear keep it locked away. Let it out. Let it shine. You never know whose life you might change." 3 months later, the old woman was back in her small town, back in her modest house with the faded wallpaper and the worn furniture. Her piano sat in the corner where it had always been, its keys still yellowed, its wood still smooth from decades of use. The trophy from the competition sat on a shelf nearby, but she rarely looked at it. It was just an object, a piece of metal shaped like a person. It was not what mattered. What mattered was the music. Every afternoon, just like she had done for 75 years, she sat down at her piano, and she played. Sometimes, her granddaughter was there, studying at the kitchen table while listening. Sometimes her children visited, sitting in the chairs where their father used to sit. Sometimes, she was alone, just her and the instrument that had been her faithful companion through every chapter of her life. And sometimes, when the light was right and the house was quiet, she could almost feel her husband sitting in his old armchair, his eyes closed, his face peaceful, listening to her play just like he always had. She smiled and let her fingers dance across the keys. The music, as always, said everything that needed to be said.